I believe we have a lightning and thunderstorm occurring out there tonight.
Last week.
First trumpet, maybe? No, I don't think so. I want to tie up some loose ends from our Bible study together last week. We were on that first trumpet, which is Revelation 8, and just one verse 7. And maybe a little bit of this will be review, but it's really, really small what would be review, because I trust your minds that you're both grasping and remembering. But one thing that I think is always helpful is whenever you have a little time to reflect. Anytime you have a little time to reflect, then when you come back and look at it again, the pieces of the puzzle just seem to fit together a little better. And I think you'll see that happening as we just quickly review, and then tonight we are going into that second trumpet. So in these loose ends that I have to tidy up from last week, as I say, they're going to bridge, because they're going to address a particular idea that we're going to be looking at in more detail tonight. And I think it will make sense to you and hopefully make more sense. So I have this under 7 different points, believe it or not. 7 points. Some of these we'll do quickly, and some of these we might spend a few minutes with. So number 1, this word, I know we talked about this last time, but just to show you this word voices, which appears, where was it? That was all the way back in verse 5, the second half of verse 5. It's interesting how you have to be careful with any translation, the KJV not accepted, where you can have a word, and not just in the King James translation, it could be in the New International Version or the Revised Standard Version or the New American Standard Bible. It could be in any version, because translations are just that. They're a translation from a foreign language to our language. For this particular Bible that I use, the KJV, it's from 400 years ago. So some of the words used in the KJV either aren't used in the same way today or aren't used at all. I can think of a word in English, which is this word. I don't know if you realize this, but this word, scan, when we say, honey, I scanned over the newspaper, what do we mean by that today?
Read it really briefly.
What did it mean 120 years ago? Just the opposite. It literally meant just the opposite 120 years ago. It meant to read something thoroughly. So language evolves, language changes. So if you saw this word 200 years ago and you're reading it today, you would have a completely wrong understanding of what was being said. And it's just because times have changed, language evolves, and language changes. So it's not that anything has changed in the KJV, it's just this was a word that, the Greek word, by the way, that they translated voices is this word, which translates P-H-O-N-A-I, phonai. We get our word phonics, or phonic, from that. When you're reading the King James translation and you see voices, then immediately your mind starts to think kind of in some weird directions, like, I wonder, was it human voices, or was it God's voice, or was it angelic voices, or maybe it's the voices of the animals on the earth screaming because the lightning is hitting them and the hail is hitting them. Your mind can go in a lot of wild and weird directions, and it's not your fault, because that's the word in the KJV, that whenever this censer of fire was cast to the earth, then there were voices. And you think, well, someone is talking. Well, as I said last time, the word simply means sounds, as we would get from phonics. It just means sounds. Or you could say noises. Or you could say that it refers to rumblings of thunder, because I think that's what's going on here. And notice the same word is going to be used again. We won't have to have this discussion in the future. And the last verse of this chapter, look down at verse 13. Same word, it's phonai in the Greek, Phonai. And I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the three angels which are yet to sound. Well, trumpets don't have voices, but they do have distinct sounds or noises. So here it would probably be sound, the other sounds that will come from the trumpets. That's probably a better translation than noises, which shows you something else, that you can take the same Greek word and translate it with two different English words. It depends on the context. You know, you can't just say, well, this word has to mean this and always mean that. That's not true by any stretch of the imagination, neither Greek or Hebrew or English. If you're going from English to French or to German, depending on the context, you might want to translate it differently. So that's number one. So that gives us a good grasp and understanding of voices in the King James. And actually in my Bible, I just left it that way. It's kind of an interesting word, but I know that it doesn't mean voice. It means noises or sounds. All right, number two tonight. Staying with the second half of verse 5. I think, as I briefly argued last week, didn't spend much time, not going to now, but just maybe now you've had time to reflect on it, I think that the second half of verse 5 is only a description of the first trumpet. If you look at what it's talking about, rumblings, thunderings, and lightnings, what does that describe except the first trumpet, hail and fire? Doesn't have anything to do with what we're going to see in the second or the third or fourth or fifth or sixth. Nothing to do at all. So when you look at the contents of the first trumpet and you look back at the end of verse 5, then I think it should be fairly obvious that all John has done, the reason that he's mentioned that in verse 5, even though it doesn't happen until verse 7, is he's just trying to wrap up and put a bow on what he has been talking about with regard to the prayers of the saints. He's been talking about how people on earth have prayed, God in heaven has answered, and he shows it by throwing the fire down, and here's the result. So for me, and I probably, as I said last week, I'm in the minority opinion on this. I just think it's John's pre-event recounting of the efficacy, the effectiveness of the prayers of the saints, just to complete that narrative before he goes any further. But in looking at what 5b describes, I think it's the same thing as being described after the first trumpet is blown in verse 7. Number 3, speaking of the first trumpet blown and what follows after that, what follows after the sounding of the first trumpet and what actually causes the damage from this storm are the two things mentioned as hail and fire, or we could say hail and lightning. Those are the two things that actually cause the damage. And so when we get to this third item, mingled with blood, keep in mind the blood can't hurt any vegetation. So I would steer away from any literal interpretation of that being blood. How can blood being dropped on some plants or some trees hurt anything? That's not going to do any destruction. And destruction is what the trumpets are after. Surely there's rain happening during this thunder and lightning storm. The rain would do what? It would just wash the blood away. So I don't think the blood is doing any damage. So the blood is not one of these terrible things that's coming from the first trumpet that's causing harm. So consequently, I would interpret the blood along some other line, however you want to, but away from it being literal blood. Don't forget, because this gets very little love in the discussion of this first trumpet, don't forget that there was an earthquake. It's not given any attention at all. But that's the last thing mentioned in the end of verse 5. There were voices or Noises, sounds, rumblings, thunderings, lightnings. That's all a part of the first trumpet, and an earthquake, which I think also I would have to take as part of the first trumpet. And what comes with an earthquake, as I've said before, it's a shifting of the earth's crust, and often it's accompanied with volcanoes. And volcanoes have molten lava, and lava has what? It throws things into the sky that look like blood because it's a red color. So however you want to interpret it, and I even remember reading that there was a storm in 1901 that fell across parts of southern Europe that came down with rain that was red. It was raining red. It wasn't bright red like your sweater, but it was red. It was tinged with red, all the rain was. What was that caused by? Oh, something mysterious. No, it was red sand that had been picked up in North Africa, had been taken up in a thunderstorm, taken across the Mediterranean, and when it rained in southern Europe, it rained with a little tinge of red. So I think there's so many ways to explain the mingle with blood without it being human or animal blood. Color of the lightning in the storm, color of a volcano, rain that maybe is red because of the commotion and the sand and dust that's been taken up. There are a lot of different ways to explain that and not go down a really weird path of blood. So maybe it has to do with rain. I don't know. In the fourth place, you see how we're tidying up from last week. In the fourth place, speaking of rain, never mentions it here after the blowing of this trumpet. I think we may naturally assume that if there's a hail and lightning storm, then there is rain, but it never mentions it. Unlike what happened in Noah's day, when it was the rain above everything that caused the problem. There might have been lightnings and thunders then, but what caused the damage on the earth, what caused the annihilation of all the people outside the ark, was definitely water. And that was the rain that was coming down. No rain is mentioned here, but I think we can assume that there was rain. But it's not what caused the damage. In the fifth place, speaking of damage, although we may assume that the hail that fell stripped leaves from the trees, bent, broke the vegetation and the grass, the first trumpet destruction is actually concentrated on what? On fire, on lightning. You see, if you read this carefully and then you back away from it, then you have a week to think about it, you go, this is a lightning storm that would have, we're told, that has hail, that has lightning. We would assume it has rain. So what did the rain do? We're not even told that it did rain. The rain, we're not told, did anything. It definitely had hail. What did the hail do? Well, we can probably assume that it did some damage. Turn back over to where we were, I think, last week, and didn't we look briefly at the plague of hail in Exodus 9? Yeah. It's a long section here from verse 13 all the way through 26. But I think we only read, if I remember correctly, maybe just verse 23. I'm in Exodus chapter 9. But we're going to read from verse 23 to the end of this plague, which is verse 26, or even 25. Moses stretched forth his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail. So this is a lightning storm full of hail. And the fire ran along upon the ground. Well, I think that's the fire that came from the lightning. And the Lord rained hail. But the emphasis here in the plague is not as much on the lightning as it is on the hail upon the land of Egypt. So there was hail and fire mingled with the hail, very grievous, such as there was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. And look what the hail did. The hail is what did the damage. The lightning scared everyone, and the hail did the damage. The hail smote throughout all the land of Egypt, all that was in the field, both man and beast, and the hail smote every herb of the field and brake every tree of the field. It's very obvious that this first trumpet cast a glance back to this plague on Egypt. All the details don't have to be the same, and they definitely aren't. But it definitely is looking backwards to that time. It's just some of what has happened after the blowing of the first trumpet has changed from that plague on Egypt. Rather than the hail beating everything down, as we were told in Exodus 9, it is the fire or the lightning that causes the damage, because look in the middle and end of verse 7. They were cast upon the earth. A third part of the trees was burned up, not beaten down. And all the green grass was not beaten down, but burnt up. So the emphasis is definitely on the lightning. And that's why rather than say anything about lightning, it just calls it fire in verse 7. This, of the two things, the hail and the fire, this is the thing that is highlighted as what's causing the damage on what? 1/3 part of the trees were burnt up. In the sixth place, speaking of 1/3, we broached this subject last time. Was it a 1/3 of contiguous land on the earth? So we know that the earth is roughly 70%, its surface is roughly 70% water and 30% land. So we only have 30% of the whole globe that this trumpet and its effects could have caused damage on. That would be on the land, on the earth. There's only 1/3 of it, and it says 1/3 of the earth or 1/3 of the trees were burned up. So I don't know what South America is in proportion to all the dry land, but is that saying that South America had a lightning storm and it was all burned up, and that would be 1/3 of the 30% of the earth that's dry land? Is that what it's saying? Or, as we talked about last time, is this a series of storms or a storm that moves around and affects area A, then jumps 200 miles, area B, and it is simply pockets all around the globe? Or is there even another way, and maybe even a better way, to look at this? Remember that phrase, that fraction, 1/3, is pretty important because it appears 12 times from here to the end of this chapter. It's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Now, in modern times, 1/3 is 33.33333. In olden times, they weren't that concerned about precision. 1/3 just means 1 out of 3. It doesn't have to mean 33 point to infinity. It just means a fraction, and it's this type of a fraction. It brings to mind another totally unrelated point, but you've got to keep in mind, this is not written, Old or New Testament, in precise mathematical, scientific, astronomy days and terms, because they didn't have those. So when we've talked about numbers before, we talked about in chapter 5 when it said around the throne were 10,000 times 10,000 angels and then thousands of thousands. It's simply because that phrase 10,000, which in, where'd I put my marker? Guess what that phrase is? It's the biggest number they had in Greek to use. They didn't have 1,000,000, then 1,000,000,000, then 1,000,000,000,000, and then whatever the next number is. That's all in modern times. They didn't need to count like that then, like we do today. But guess what the term for 10,000 is in? It is so interesting. It is myriad.
A whole lot.
Yeah, so isn't that a great name in Greek? And what that means is it means this number right here. And notice how that has come right over into the English language to mean whole lot. Just means a whole lot. So what they have to say is myriad of myriads. So then they end up with their 10,000 times 10,000, which just means millions and billions is what it means. And so when we come to this 1/3, we don't have to think of it's got to be exactly precise, but it means a fraction, and it means somewhere around 30%. But where I was going a moment ago was go back to your understanding of the seals. This is going to be very important for where we're going later tonight and your whole understanding of all of this. I'm afraid that too many people who teach on this, it's not because they don't know, it's because they don't spend enough time in the Bible, in the text, in the passage, and thinking about what they're saying. So I've heard plenty of sermons on all of this, and they'll teach, and there's okay to do this in one sense. They'll teach chapter 8. Well, heck, they'll teach the whole book of Revelation in 1 hour, and then they're done. Or a better person will spend, one whole 45 minutes on chapter 8. And that's okay, but what can happen, it doesn't have to happen, but what can and often does happen is because you were so brief and superficial, you didn't give yourself enough time to really figure out what the ramifications of what you're saying are. And so consequently, as they're looking at the seals, everybody's just thinking global. And as they're looking at the trumpets, they're just thinking global. And as they're looking at the bowls, they're thinking global. Yeah, this is, this first seal that's broken, this rider on a white horse went out conquering and to conquer, and that's like global warfare. But we saw that was not the case at all. That was one or two nations probably having a fight with a neighboring nation. He went forth conquering, means he was successful, and to conquer, and he's going to go a little further. But it's not global. It's wherever that is in the world at that time, probably very narrowly confined. And the second seal, which was the red horse, and he has a great sword in his hand, and he comes to take peace from the earth and so that men can kill one another. Yeah. But if you just sit down, rather than just globalize everything, generalize everything, if you sit down and think, well, if nation A attacked nation B and was successful, and then attacked nation C and was successful, then maybe D, E, and F that are surrounding those that just fell are going to say, we've got to do something to stop this encroachment toward us. And so they band together and they fight against the original person represented by the first seal. So my point is that's all still in some relatively small area. I don't know if it's Europe, Asia, Africa, I have no idea where. But I think that is what is taking place there. My point is the original, at least the beginning of the seals, were very localized. They're small. They're localized somewhere. Then let's come back to what we're talking about here when it says 1/3. Maybe that's a hint on how we are to interpret at least these early trumpets being blown, that when it says they were cast upon the earth and a third part of the trees was burnt up and all the green grass. And remember I said, we looked at a verse over in the early part of chapter 9 last time, that it just means all the green grass wherever the trees are that were burned up, because the earth still has green grass on it. Then maybe it means something a little more localized. Keep that in mind, and we will finish that a little later tonight. And then finally, and in the 7th place tonight, this word grass. I said before, and I'll always say, please look for whatever the easiest interpretation is first for a passage, a word, a concept. If easy doesn't work, then look for something more difficult. And here's what I mean by that. I've seen people who read this in Revelation 8, and it says that the grass was burned up, and they don't think that means grass. You say, well, why wouldn't they? Well, because they have a verse. And what grass means is that this killed a whole lot of people. And that the grass refers to people. Where did they get that? Turn over to Isaiah 40. They actually have a verse. In Isaiah 40, verse 6, we read, "The voice said, cry, and I said, what shall I cry? All flesh is grass, and all the goodliness thereof is as the flower of the field. The grass withereth, the flower fadeth, but the Spirit of the Lord bloweth, because the Spirit of the Lord bloweth upon it. Surely the people is grass." Or we would say the people are grass. So you say, oh, see, I've got a verse that people are grass. Well, this is some poetic language back here in Isaiah chapter 40. And that's just can't be, dug out of Isaiah 40 and brought over here to Revelation 8. If something is going to have that meaning, it's probably going to give us a good indication or an absolute this is that kind of answer. And you'll see this when we get to chapter 17, when it talks about waters, talks about the great prostitute or harlot in chapter 17 that sits upon many waters. But then that very same chapter, the end of the chapter, tells us that the waters are peoples. Yeah. So when it tells us that, then we're okay. We know that the waters symbolize something there. But he goes on and tells us that. He doesn't leave us in the dark. Here in chapter 8, grass is grass. Grass is not people. All right, so that's my 7 things I wanted to say to tidy up loose ends. Now look, if we look at these seals, the first one and the second one, which we're going to do tonight, the statements about these are so brief, they're so bare-boned, they're of such a compact nature that the horror that they describe is just about impossible to feel. All we have are black letters on a white page. That's our Bible. We have black letters on a white page. And it's just about impossible. I won't say it's just about, it is impossible to feel the impact. And yet that's all we've got. This is what God chose to give us, are these pages of Scripture, black letters on white pages. And so why? Why does God give us so little on something that is so traumatic? And I've talked about this a little before, but let me give you just 3 ideas, suggestions why we're given so little to talk about so much. Number 1, this is just common sense, economy of space. The Bible is already a big, thick book with a whole lot to say. And so we have an economy of space, and where it maximizes the use of words are in areas that have to do with who God is, who we are, and what's caused the problem between the two, and how that can be reconciled. We would want there to be way more information about that than these, if I can call it, these dumb trumpets. I would want to know way more about God, me, my problem, and God's solution. So it's just economy of space. He doesn't have enough to write another, would have a wheelbarrow dragging a Bible or a bunch of Bibles around if we were given as much information as we would all wish that we had. So that's number 1. Number 2, this is very interesting. Another reason, the Bible's normal practice is not to divulge all the gory details about some particular story like this. That's the Bible's normal practice. And one of the ways that the early Christians of the first few centuries were able to identify, one among many, the books that God wanted to be a part of the final canon of Scripture was they would read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, for instance, and look at the account of the crucifixion, and they would compare that with other gospels that had been written that would talk about the crucifixion. And in what became Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we know that Jesus suffered. We know that he was beaten. We know that he hung on a cross. We know that he suffered. We know that he bled. We know that he had a spear driven into his side. And then he died. And that's all we're told.
Yeah.
And that makes sense. It's not giving us the details from a medical, from an autopsy, from a coroner's report. Now, this is exactly what was going on, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then that happened. It's the Bible's normal procedure not to give all of those gory details. And it helps distinguish or separate biblical books from apocryphal or pseudepigraphal books, which will go into all kinds of fanciful details. Another topic is the topic of hell. The Bible does tell us things about hell, and it uses things like outer darkness. If you're around a campfire, and what's it like to be on that outside perimeter where you're on the outer limits of the light and it's mostly dark out there. It gives us some beautiful descriptions. It talks about where the fire is not quenched, and we go, well, how can that be? Because normally fire, once it is finished doing its business, it means it has consumed, and eventually, if there's no more product to consume, the fire goes out. But this fire doesn't. The Bible gives us some incredible and deep analogies of biblical truths without telling us what Dante's Inferno, where it has all of these levels of hell, and where in the Middle Ages, what hell was, where people were put on torture racks and see how far you could stretch until you pull their arms off and pull their legs off. The Bible doesn't talk about nonsense like that. So I'm saying it's just the Bible's procedure not to go into those kind of gory details on the cross, on hell, on these terrible plagues that we're looking at here in the book of Revelation. And then thirdly and finally on why. Why is it so brief? It's left to the reader's imagination to paint between the lines. And that's why I've been a proponent of and have suggested watching movies, good old Hollywood movies that are something about a lightning storm or a flood, for you to try to feel the impact of what's being said. But whether we can feel it or not, and a lot of that's going to depend on your ability to meditate and do due diligence to help participate in what you're reading. Whether or not we can feel it, it's going to happen. And that's the point. When I was reading, for example, for an illustration, when I was reading this past summer, I spent a lot of time reading the book of Ezekiel over and over and over, and reading some good commentaries on it. And it takes that to get into the person of Ezekiel. The good actors and good actresses today, they have to become that character. And the really good ones, they're not just reading a script. They will go and practice for 6 months. If it's a homeless character they have to portray, they have to go and become that so they can see, what is this like? There's no way that they can accurately portray that unless they can somewhat become that. Right. So I wasn't trying to do anything extreme with Ezekiel, but I wanted to feel. I just love the prophet Ezekiel, and my study of his book, all 48 chapters, just made me love him and appreciate him. And just by reading 48 chapters, you don't get that. That's my point. You just don't get it. You just see little tidbits and little highlights. But one of the things Ezekiel had to do, among many, was he had to lie down on one side for 390 days and on his other side for 40 days. That's a long period of time. So I didn't do it for even one day. I didn't even do it for 10 minutes. But I remember after studying and thinking, what did Ezekiel have to go through? What a man of God, what a prophet. What did he have to go through? And I go through so little, and he went through so much. And so one night, my wife was gone out of town somewhere. Before I went to bed, I got down at the end of my bed on the floor, and I just lay down on one side for like a minute. For a minute. 390 days. I thought, wow, that's uncomfortable. You know, I don't have what Ezekiel had. I just don't have that. Yeah. I thought, wow. And then you read all the other things that he went through. So that's just one of my examples, just a puny, pitiful test case scenario. So he had to get out on one side for 390 days. So I'm just saying it's up to us in our meditation and our participation with the writer and the narrative that he's giving us as to how much we're really going to feel the impact of it. So watch something, see a movie, or just sit here and think. I think I gave you the illustration last time, or at least we read Psalm 29. I don't know if I talked about it, but we read Psalm 29, which talks about the voice of the Lord. Yeah. And that's a poetic phrase referring to God's voice. The psalmist David said, the voice of the Lord is like thunder. And as he is watching a lightning and thunderstorm pass, he is hearing the voice of the Lord. And I had an experience while I sat out on my front porch at our home in New England during a thunderstorm, and the lightning was flashing and the thunder was booming and shaking. And I evidently had just finished reading or meditating or studying the 29th Psalm, and I've never forgotten it. That has never left me. Why? Because I was able to somehow experience it. So that's all my plea is. If there's any way we can find to experience some of these things, then it becomes so much more meaningful and it stays with you for a long time. Okay, we ready to do quickly the second trumpet? The second trumpet, verses 8 and 9. And the second angel sounded, and as it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood. There's our third part. And the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died. There's our third part. And the third part of the ships were destroyed. Now remember last time that we're going to look at this, the object, the means, the result, and the net effects. I'm trying to look at all these, at least these first few trumpets being blown under 4 categories. So we'll start with the object. The object, what do we read there? He said that this was thrown or cast into the sea. We see it in the middle of verse 8, was cast into the sea. In the end of verse 8, the third part of the sea. And the beginning of verse 9, the third part of the creatures which were in the sea. So I'm going to jump ahead of myself just a little bit and say this so that we can cover this one tonight. When we get to the next trumpet, we'll be dealing with fresh water. So now we are obviously dealing with, or if it's not obvious, now it is, we are dealing with salt water. And I said before tonight that roughly 70% of the surface of the globe is covered by water. So whatever this is that's being thrown or falling into the water has a 3 out of 4 chance of hitting the water. So it's pretty likely it's going to hit the water, which it does, rather than the land. We're going to come back to the object here in a minute. Let's look at the means. What's causing this problem? Well, as John witnesses this, remember, he's a faithful witness. Jesus appeared to him in chapter 1 and said, the things that you see, write in a scroll and send to the 7 churches in Asia. So John saw this happening. And as he witnesses this, he describes what to him could only have been something so large, so big, so tall, so wide, that it reminded him of a mountain. It wasn't a mountain, but it reminded him of a mountain. He had no other words in his vocabulary Going back to what I said earlier tonight, this was not the age of geology and astronomy and medicine. And the word that came to his mind as he saw this was a mountain. Whatever it was mountainous. It's the only comparison that he could come up with. And that's exactly what it is. It is a comparison. If you will notice, he says, as it were. He didn't say it was a mountain. He said, as it were a mountain. And wait till we get to chapter 9. You're going to see this like a gazillion times in chapter 9. Because in chapter 9, he has so much difficulty. Chapter 9 is the chapter of all in this book, but he has so much difficulty describing what he's seeing because he's never seen it before, and none of us have ever seen it before. And so he says, well, this is what it reminds me of. And so you know what this is, and the Bible is absolutely full of these. We call it a simile. And the Bible also has lots and lots of metaphors. A metaphor is a simile. It's just a lot stronger because it leaves out one of these two words, as or like. And that word like, which is the same as it were, is like the most popular word in the English language today. You can hardly hear anyone born in the last 25 years in this generation who has any more words than this word in their vocabulary. So if a girl is told she wants to go somewhere, she wants to go to the mall, and she asked her mother, and her mother said no, and she's retelling that story to someone else, you know what she'll say? She will say, well, I asked my mother, and she said no. Like what? That was one sentence that had like in it 3 times, all of which were misused. If you ask someone like your mother, then it wasn't your mother you asked. And if she gave you an answer, she didn't answer. And if the answer was no, then the answer wasn't no. You know, there is something wrong with people who cannot find any other word to use besides like. It's okay to use like if it's a simile. So, let me give you this story. Okay, so the last few months I have been fishing, and the fish that I am after is not something that people would normally know, but it's like another fish. You see, it is like another one. It is not the other one, but it's like it. And so, because it's similar to it and in the same family, if I were talking to someone from, say, central Kentucky north to Wisconsin to Minnesota to Canada, they know what a walleye is. A walleye is an important game fish that they fish for. And so if I think that they might not know what I'm after, and I say I went and caught some fish, and they say, well, what'd you catch? I could say it was like a walleye. But that's not what it is. You know what it is? It is a sauger. But if they don't know what a sauger is, it doesn't do me any good to tell them I caught sauger. It's like, so what? What is that? I have no idea what that is. But here is a case where the speaker, me, knows what this means and the listener doesn't know what it means. With John, who is writing this, sometimes both the writer and the reader don't know what this thing is. John didn't know what it was. And the reader definitely doesn't know what it was. So John has to use the only thing he can use, and that is a simile, where a simile is trying to describe some object that's either unknown to the writer and the reader, or at least is unknown to the reader, and so it is a comparison. You take something that is known to help them understand what is not known. And so what John takes is a mountain. Let's go back and look at verse 8. The second angel sounded, and as it were, a great mountain Well, since it came from the sky, it's obviously not a mountain, because that's not where mountains come from. But what John saw was a meteorite that came and struck the water. The good way that I came up with to keep in mind the distinctions are goes like this. Roids are above, rights strike the earth, and ores are anywhere in between. Meteoroids are in outer space, and there's billions of them all at one time going in every possible direction. So roids are above. Meteors enter our atmosphere to the rate of, they have estimated, 25 million per day. Meteors go from outer space into our atmosphere. But most of them are so small, so tiny, they're not even as big as a golf ball. They simply burn up when they come into the Earth's atmosphere. What John is saying is the worst nightmare of your doomsday scientist. And that is a meteorite. Came from outer space. It survived entrance into the Earth's atmosphere. It's large, it's big, it's tall, it's wide, it's deep, it's immense, it's thick, it's solid, and it looks like Mount McKinley or Pikes Peak, or if you have stood at the foot of the Himalayas or the Andes or the Alps or the Rockies, it looked to him like a giant mountain. And it is thrown into the sea. The largest meteorite, most of the meteorites have hit the sea, so we've never found them. The largest meteorite that I'm aware of that we know was called Hoba. It was discovered in 1920 in Namibia in South Africa, and it weighed, they estimate, because you can't dig it up, 60 tons. 60 tons. That's still a relatively small speck. How did they find it? The farmer who owned the field literally was plowing, and his disc, rather than going through dirt, and rather than hitting a rock, hit something that went ping, something that was metal. And he hit Hoba, H-O-B-A, the largest meteorite that we've been able to discover so far. He hit this meteorite that is 20% nickel and 80% iron. It's not even a rock, it's just a big piece of metal. And it's still there to this day. Now they have chiseled off parts of it and they've been sold for thousands of dollars, and I think they built something around it so that people will not keep hammering away at it, but it's something that came from outer space. But it hit the land and not the sea. That's just a small example, and there are many other craters still in the earth, and there are other meteorites, remains that are still in different parts. There's one big one here in our country out in Arizona, and they are literally all around the globe. That's just the ones that have hit the 30% of the earth that is land and not water. This one, we're told, is what? How we know what it is. John didn't know what it was. It looked to him like a big mountain falling out of the sky. But it came burning with fire. That's exactly what they do. It's a result of the atmospheric friction, the speed of the object. That's why the little ones don't survive. They're just consumed and burned up. The big ones, as they're falling, a big one like this would be a huge ball of fire. Look over in a mountain burning with fire is what he sees. Look over in Jeremiah 51. Jeremiah is not talking about this, but I think the language, as so often is the case in the book of Revelation, the language harkens back to an Old Testament prophecy. Isaiah 51, which is an oracle of the prophet Jeremiah against Babylon, how Babylon is going to fall.
Wait, you said Isaiah or Jeremiah?
I'm sorry, whatever I said, I meant Jeremiah 51 and verse 25. Just look at the terminology here. It is definitely reminiscent of what we read in Revelation, although I'm not saying this was a meteorite. This is Babylon. But I think purposely the New Testament will use language from the Old Testament. Verse 25, behold, I am against thee, O destroying mountain. Speaking of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. Saith the Lord, which destroyeth all the earth, and I will stretch out mine hand upon thee, and roll thee down from the rocks, and will make thee a burnt mountain, which is exactly what is described over here in Revelation chapter 8. This mountain burning with fire. You know, back in the 1960s, when I was alive, there was, this was post-Second World War. The Soviet Union and the United States had been on the same side in the Second World War, so they were friends at that time. But after the war, the Soviet Union wanted to hold on to some of the properties that they had helped liberate. And so we have the ensuing Cold War that was happening all during the 1950s and all during the 1960s. And they were both, the Soviet Union and the United States, flexing their political muscle and trying to show who they were. And so they entered into what was called back then the race to space, because people had not been to space, no one had been to the moon. And the Soviets were the first into space, but the Americans were the first to land on the moon. And in one of those post-lunar landing adventures that the United States engaged in, which was Apollo 13, which they have made a very interesting movie about, by the way, had severe problems after they got up into space and could not make it all the way to the moon. And so, I mean, I am a young child, not quite a teenager yet, and this is big news that we have this spacecraft with 3 American astronauts that don't have what it takes to get to the moon, and we don't think they have what it takes to get back. So this was just a traumatic event that was unfolding on national television in April of 1970. And so just through, if you watch the movie, not all of it's true, but a lot of it is true, through the engineering genius of mission control and the astronauts aboard that space capsule, they finagled their way and figured out how if we short this out, we can get some power over here. And what they needed to do was to get back close enough to the Earth, which was next to impossible to do, where they could catch the gravitational pull of the Earth and pull them back into the atmosphere and then go land in the ocean. And on April the 17th, that's exactly what they did. They lost communication, which they always do as they're coming into the Earth's atmosphere, for what they were expecting to be 4 minutes. But then they got to 5 minutes and 5.5 minutes. And we all pretty much thought they were toast. They were gone. Because there's no radio communication during that little time period at all. And all of a sudden, I think shortly after 6 minutes, radio communication came back. But you could look in the sky. I couldn't from where we live, but you could look in the sky, and do you know what you saw? A falling ball of fire. It had the space protective shields around it, the fire shields around it. And they didn't know if they could survive the heat at that speed and re-entry, but they did. They splashed down, they were recovered, and the men lived to tell about it, and they did a motion picture about it. But they came into the atmosphere burning with fire. That's what's happening with this meteorite. The second angel sounded, and as it were, a great mountain, which was a meteorite, burning with fire, was cast into the sea. That's the next part I want to come to. Cast into the sea. And then evidently what John sees, the first thing that John notices is just a result of what happened. And that was a third part of the sea became blood. And then he goes on to see maybe what caused that. A third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died. And then he saw the other effect. Not only was there death to marine life, there was also death to human life because a third part of the ships were destroyed. Now we're going to go all the way back. I might keep you a couple of minutes long tonight, but we got to go all the way back to this business of 1/3 and this business of what is the second trumpet actually affecting? What is the first trumpet actually affecting? The first one said they were cast upon the earth. It's interesting that there is a word for earth in Greek, and it's cosmos. There is a word, and it can mean different things. It's translated world, it's translated earth. But there's another word, which is the word here, which in Greek looks like this, which looks like this in English. Gay, just G-E, gay. That's the word used here. And it could refer to, I mean, we think of the earth, I think we think of the globe. We think of the whole earth and not part of the earth. That's not the word used here. It's actually this word gay, which is better probably translated land. Because I think there's a contrast from the first trumpet to the second trumpet between what? Land and sea. Not between earth and sea, but between dry land and that which is wet, between land and sea. So it tells us that a third of the sea turned to blood. Hopefully you can tell very gradually where I'm going with this. As I said earlier tonight, the popular presentation of this is that everything we're seeing happen here in Revelation is global. And I'm just going to warn you in advance, that's probably not going to be the case, and you're probably going to have a lot better understanding of a lot of things here if we know that up front. So for instance, when we get to a long time from now, I think it's Revelation 16:16, talking about the Battle of Armageddon, we go, oh yeah, the Battle of Armageddon. That's when every nation in the whole world is gathered together and they're going to fight against God. That's probably not true, because that's not what that passage in the preceding verses prior to verse 16 in chapter 16 say. That's not what that says. But I think that that is the normal way that everyone processes this, because that's the normal way all of this is preached, that everything is global. But what sea does John know about? Does he know about the Indian Ocean? Or does he know about the Pacific?
Mediterranean.
He knows about the Mediterranean. That is probably, I mean, he's on the island of Patmos, which is in the Aegean Sea, which is just a little northern finger off of the Mediterranean Sea. The only sea that he probably knew about was the Mediterranean Sea. These little fingers, Aegean Sea, Adriatic Sea over by Italy, they have different names, but it's still all a part of the Mediterranean Sea. You know, it's just difficult, in my mind, if you're going to globalize this, and the sea means all 5 oceans, Arctic, Antarctic, Indian, Pacific, Atlantic, those are the 5 oceans, 7 continents, 5 oceans. I think that's the way people read this, because that's the way that it's preached. That this hit the sea, which means the oceans. It hit the oceans, and then a third of all of the oceans turned to blood. Is that realistic? That doesn't seem to be realistic to me. So the way I would read these things is they're probably on a much more limited scale. And keep this in mind, and I'm jumping way ahead, and this is one of those messages, at least the end of this tonight, where it'll take you a little time to process this. Once you walk away and process it, then, you know, the pieces of the puzzle start fitting together again. Remember that Jesus, in one of his teachings on what it would be like before the second coming, he said, as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. And we know the days of Noah were evil and wicked above everything, but that's not what he was talking about, because that's not what he went on to say. Anytime the Bible makes a reference, we can't just make it mean something else. What he said was, as it was in the days of Noah, that people were marrying and giving in marriage. In other words, life was still happening. It wasn't like the world didn't exist or it was just hanging by a thread and there were 72 people left alive. You know, the world was still, life was going on to the point that there was two men in the field, one taken and one left. Two women grinding at a meal, one taken and one left. People were marrying, people were giving in marriage. Being in the field, grinding meal to grain to make meal depicts normal life is still happening. So if we make these judgments too global, too universal, we're going to run into some problems with some other passages of the Bible. So when it says sea, I don't know what sea. Maybe it is the Mediterranean. Maybe it's the Sea of Japan. Maybe it's the Caribbean. Maybe it's the, who knows? Maybe it's the Bering Sea. There are a lot of seas that are not ocean, although they are part of it or linked to it. But it says that whenever this meteorite hit this sea, that a third of it, maybe it only means that if this is the Mediterranean Sea, and it hits right here, then maybe it just means in this area, a third of that area is what was turned to blood. I think this might be a safer way to look at this so you don't end up with these weird scenarios of how in the world you're going to have the entire Atlantic Ocean bloody and turned to blood. But if a meteorite large enough hit an area dense enough in population of marine life, and the very impact, which would cause percussion, is going to instantly kill. The percussion is what kills. You can kill fish by shooting a high-powered rifle into the water near them, not because you hit them, but because the percussion bursts their swim bladder and they can no longer survive, and so they die. But the impact would be bigger than a gunshot because this is something that is burning like a mountain and it hits some part of some sea somewhere. The first thing that John notices is the water's got a real bloody color to it. Well, no surprise, because if you've got dolphins and porpoises and whales and all kinds of sea life and marine life there, ducks, water birds that are sitting there that dive and feed, you can extrapolate yourself and realize there's a whole lot that could be happening here that could cause just a portion of the area that it hit to be turned to blood. So that's the point I wanted to make with regard to the 1/3. So 1/3 of the sea, I don't think that's the oceans all around the world, turned to blood. 1/3 of the marine life. He said in verse 9, a third part of the creatures which were in the sea. That's more than obviously just fish. It's any of the marine inhabitants. They were killed. And moreover, he said, a third part of the ships were destroyed. So you have your cargo ships, you have your passenger liners, you have Navy vessels and warships, you have fishing vessels of every type and size and length and sort are wiped out along with the people on those boats. That's the result. And let me wrap up tonight finally. And I'm sorry I kept you a little long. The net effects are something that you have to use your own, again, imagination over. There are trillions and trillions of marine forms of life in all of these bodies of salt water. So you've got the death of all of these animals. You have the blood that comes as a result of that. You have just a catastrophic loss of food, loss of commercialism, loss of, trans-sea commerce, you've got loss of ships, you've got loss of human life, you've got loss of jobs. Depending on where this hits and how close to land it is or how far away, you've got coastal flooding and death. You have tsunamis. You have simply all kinds of problems. And just to give you in one little capsule, one idea of the net effects of something like this, the Bering Sea, which is that part of the North Pacific that's between the Soviet Union and Alaska, which is about the size of Alaska, is the richest fishing grounds in the world. Every day there are 7,000 fishing vessels plying those waters. 7,000 in that area, the size of Alaska, because of the food resource that's available there. And there is one particular boat that's called America's Finest, which is one of the most sophisticated fishing vessels that has ever been made. It probably is the most sophisticated. It will go out on a 2-week stint of fishing. Their overhead is $1 million per trip out, but they will catch $2 million worth of fish of every species and variety. You've got 7,000 more vessels out there, all doing what? Fishing, supplying the world with what? Part of its food, a favorite food, and that is food that comes from salt water. So you just have a little bit of a disruption somewhere in the world. It doesn't have to be global, but somewhere in the world of this type of industry and this type of commerce, and just extrapolate from there what the other and further effects would be.